I'm 62 years old, and the only reason I still own my medical practice, my building, and the retirement I spent 30 years building is because I made one quiet decision the day I got engaged to my second husband. I never told him or his two grown children that the property we lived in, the building my practice operated out of, or any of it was mine alone. Some people might call that dishonest. I call it the smartest thing I've ever done. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the daughter of a school nurse and a man who fixed appliances for a living. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. My mother used to say, "Gwendolyn, nobody's going to hand you anything. You build it yourself or you go without." I took that seriously. I put myself through undergrad on scholarships and waitressing shifts, got into medical school at 30 on my second application, raised my daughter mostly alone after my first husband walked out when she was 4, and opened my own dermatology practice in suburban Atlanta by the time I was 43. Not a partnership, not a group practice, mine. My name on the door, my signature on the lease, my personal credit on the line. That's the part people don't understand about building something. It's not just the success. It's every moment you thought you were going to lose it. The year my biggest insurance reimbursement was delayed 3 months, and I had to borrow against my house to make payroll. The summer, a water pipe burst in the building and flooded my procedure rooms 2 days before a packed schedule. The winter, my front desk manager quit without notice, and I worked the reception window myself for 6 weeks while seeing 40 patients a day. Every one of those moments made the building more mine, not less. You survive something with your own hands and it becomes part of you. By the time I was 60, I had 22 employees, a practice worth somewhere around $4 million, and I owned the commercial building outright. Bought it in 2014 when the previous owner was ready to sell. My daughter, who I'll call by the name I've always called her when things are serious, sweetheart, had her own life in Charlotte. She'd become a pharmacist, met a good man, had 2 kids who called me Grandma Gwen, and destroyed my living room every Christmas with absolute joy. I was proud, I was comfortable, and I was lonely in the specific way that only shows up after the noise stops. That's when I met my second husband. He came into my practice as a patient, a new patient referral from his primary care doctor for a skin check. He was 65, retired from a long career managing commercial real estate portfolios, recently widowed, with 2 adult children who lived in the Atlanta area. He had silver hair and an easy laugh, and he brought me a book about the history of Georgia the second time he came in for a follow-up appointment. Just left it at the front desk with a note that said, "Thought a busy doctor might like something to read that isn't a medical journal." I should have known better. I'm a doctor. I know how charm presents. But I was 60 years old, and I hadn't been properly courted in decades, and he was funny and curious, and he listened when I talked, really listened, not just waited for his turn. We dated for almost a year. He took me to Savannah for a long weekend. He learned that I loved early morning drives and started texting me at 6 a.m. with sunrise photos from wherever he happened to be walking. He met my daughter and made her laugh within 10 minutes. He seemed in every visible way like exactly what a second chapter was supposed to look like. We got engaged in October at a small dinner he'd arranged at my favorite restaurant in Buckhead. His children, his son, who worked in commercial lending, and his daughter, who was a property manager, were there. They toasted us warmly. His daughter hugged me and said she was so glad her father had found someone. I went home feeling like something broken in me had finally knit back together. The first visit his children made to my house came 3 weeks later. His daughter walked through my home the way someone walks through a house they're considering buying. Measured pauses in each room, eyes tracking to the ceilings, the windows, the finishes. When we sat in the kitchen for coffee, she asked me how long I'd owned the house. When I said 12 years, she asked whether I'd had it appraised recently. Markets have been wild, she said pleasantly. You might be sitting on more than you think. His son had different questions. He asked about my practice, not in the way people usually do, not the polite, "Oh, how wonderful, do you enjoy it?" He asked about my patient volume, whether I'd considered selling, what the market looked like for medical practice acquisitions. A lot of solo practices are consolidating into larger groups, he said. You can get a real multiple on revenue if you time it right. Have you talked to anyone about your options? I told him I was happy where I was. He smiled the way people smile when they think you don't understand a situation. Sure, of course, just something to think about. That night I mentioned it to my fiancé, not as a complaint, just as an observation. His children had asked a lot of financial questions. He squeezed my hand and said they were just protective of him after losing their mother and meant well. He said I'd grow to appreciate how close-knit they were. I let it go. My daughter called me that same week. She'd met his children briefly at the engagement dinner and she'd been sitting with something she couldn't shake. "Mom," she said, "his daughter was asking me things about your building, whether you own it or lease it, about whether you're planning to retire soon." She paused. I didn't tell her anything because I honestly wasn't sure what you'd want me to say. I told her I appreciated that. I told her she'd done the right thing. Then I made a decision, a quiet one, that I didn't announce to anyone. I decided that until I understood exactly who these people were, I was going to be strategic about what they knew. The next time his son asked about the practice, I was vague in a specific way. I said there were some complicated partnership arrangements going back years, that my attorney handled the structural side of things, that the building situation was wrapped up in a small business trust that was frankly a headache to explain. I didn't lie outright. I deflected, and I made it sound like the ownership picture was murky. I let them believe I was the operator of something more complicated and shared than I actually was. Was it entirely honest? No, but something my mother said stayed with me. Protect what you built. I was 62 years old. I had not spent 30 years fighting to hand it to people I'd known for 14 months. We got married in April. Small ceremony. My daughter was my maid of honor. His children stood up for him. We said our vows in my backyard under the dogwood tree that was just starting to bloom. I wore a pale green dress my daughter helped me pick out, and I cried a little during the vows, which I hadn't expected to do. My attorney, a woman I'd trusted for nearly 15 years, had drafted a prenuptial agreement that my husband signed without a significant fuss. He'd seemed briefly hurt when I raised it, said something about how he hoped I trusted him, but he signed. The agreement was clear. Premarital assets remained separate property. The practice, the building, the house, mine. What I did not mention to him or to his children was exactly what that meant in dollar terms. I let the vagueness I'd established before the wedding stand, the complicated trust, the murky partnership structure. The attorney handles it. It's a headache to explain. The first year of the marriage was good, mostly. He was a present, affectionate husband. He cooked dinner several nights a week. He came to my office holiday party and charmed every single one of my staff. He drove me to a conference in Nashville and spent 2 days reading in the hotel bar while I was in sessions, perfectly content. I thought I had been wrong to be cautious. I thought maybe I'd been too guarded, let old wounds make me suspicious of a man who was exactly who he seemed to be. Then year 2 arrived, and so did the requests. It started with his son stopping by the office, not as a patient, just stopping by, to bring me lunch and ask casually if I'd had any more thoughts about the consolidation conversation. There were apparently several large dermatology groups in Atlanta that were actively acquiring practices. He had contacts. He could make an introduction. All upside, no pressure. I thanked him for the sandwich and told him I'd think about it. He started showing up every few weeks, always with some reason, dropping off something for his father, picking up something nearby in the neighborhood, always with a new angle on the practice sale. Then it shifted to the building. Had I thought about a sale-leaseback arrangement, I'd get cash out of the building and keep operating in the space. Very common in medical real estate. Very tax efficient. He knew people. His sister, meanwhile, had taken a different approach with me. She invited me to lunch twice. Very warm, very sisterly. She told me about her work, her kids, her marriage. She asked about mine, and somewhere between the salad and the entree each time, she found a way to ask about the house. Was I thinking of upgrading, downsizing eventually? She managed properties. She'd be happy to help if anything changed. You've got a beautiful place, but a lot of house for 2 people. Some of my clients have done very well liquidating at this market. I was not planning to liquidate at this market or any market. The direct pressure came from my husband. He started, around month 18 of the marriage, presenting me with documents to sign. First, it was a form to update the beneficiary on one of his life insurance policies. And yes, I read every word, which was how I noticed it was not a life insurance form. It was a financial power of attorney. I put it down and said I wasn't signing it. He said it was standard, that married couples did this all the time, that it was just for convenience in case something happened to either of us. I said I would not be signing documents I hadn't reviewed with my own attorney. He got quiet for the rest of the evening. He didn't raise it again for 6 weeks. Then he brought a different document, and then another. There were phone calls he took outside, long ones. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he said it was his son. Or a friend from his old firm, or just business, nothing interesting. He started moving through my home office in the evenings, ostensibly looking for a pen, a charger, a book he thought he'd left somewhere. I started noticing things slightly out of place, a drawer not quite closed, a file folder on my desk that I remembered putting inside the cabinet. I'm a diagnostician by profession. You spend 30 years reading subtle signs and your pattern recognition becomes very good. I knew what I was looking at. I just needed to understand the shape of it. I called my attorney. I told her something felt wrong, and I needed her to do a quiet check, any filings against my properties, any documents recorded at the county level in my name that I hadn't initiated. She told me she'd look into it and called me back 4 days later. Her voice was careful in the way that means she's managing her own reaction before she delivers information. Gwendolyn, she said, someone has filed 2 documents at the Fulton County Recorder's Office. One is a quitclaim deed that purports to transfer a partial ownership interest in your commercial building to your husband. The other is an amendment to what's represented as a business partnership agreement, adding him as a 25% partner in the practice. I sat down on the exam table in my own procedure room because it was the closest surface. The signatures on both documents, she said, do not match your signature on the prenuptial agreement, your medical license application, or any document I have on file for you. They are forgeries. I asked her what I needed to do. She said file a report, seek an emergency injunction to invalidate the fraudulent filings, and be very careful about what I said at home until we understood the full picture. I went home that evening and cooked dinner and talked to my husband about a news story we'd both been following and went to bed and lay there in the dark for 4 hours, absolutely still, going through every interaction of the past 18 months and cataloguing what I'd missed and what I'd caught and what I needed to do next. I called an investigator the following morning, a woman who'd handled several background checks for me over the years when I was vetting potential practice partners. I gave her my husband's full name, his late wife's name, and asked for everything: criminal history, civil litigation, financial soak, and specifically I wanted to know about his late wife's estate, how it had been handled, whether anyone had contested anything. She came back to me in 10 days. His late wife had been a retired school administrator who'd owned a home outright in Marietta and had a pension and a significant retirement account. She developed a progressive neurological condition in her final 2 years. In the 8 months before she died, she had signed documents transferring the house into joint tenancy with her husband and rolling her investment accounts into a jointly managed trust. Her sister, her only living close relative, had contacted an attorney after the death and raised questions about whether she'd had capacity to make those decisions. The case had been reviewed and ultimately settled privately. His late wife's sister received a payment described in the agreement as full and final resolution of all claims. He kept the house. He kept the accounts. There was more. Before that wife, there had been a long-term partner. They had not married, but she had added him to the deed of her home after 3 years together. She died of what was ruled a cardiac event. She was 61. Her adult son had told anyone who would listen that his mother had been afraid of her partner in the months before she died, that she'd tried to tell him something wasn't right. No investigation had been opened. The son had gotten nothing. I sat across from my investigator at a coffee shop in Decatur and read through the summary she'd prepared and understood, with complete clarity, what I was looking at. This was not a man who had been unlucky with the women he loved. This was a man who had found a system, and I was the third attempt. I went back to my attorney that afternoon. I told her I didn't just want the fraudulent filings invalidated. I wanted a criminal case. I wanted fraud charges. I wanted it on record, and because of what the investigator had found, the pattern, the previous partner's son, the settled dispute with his late wife's sister, I wanted law enforcement looking at all of it. She told me it would be difficult. It would be public. My practice's name would be in filings. I told her my practice had survived a water pipe and a 6-week staffing crisis and 30 years of fighting for respect in a system that didn't always offer it to women who look like me. It would survive having my name attached to the prosecution of a man who tried to steal from me. We spent 2 months building it. My attorney's forensic accountant went through every financial record. They found email chains between my husband and his son discussing the timeline and the transfer strategy, and at one point, his son writing that they needed to move before she gets any smarter about the structure. They found text messages where his daughter asked whether I'd updated the will situation yet, and her father replied that I was resistant, but he was working on it. They also found, through a contact at a regional financial crimes unit, that his late wife's sister had never stopped pushing. She'd gone to the district attorney's office twice and been told both times that the civil settlement precluded further action. But the information she'd provided was on file, and by investigators' report about the long-term partner who died and whose son had been raising questions, that opened something new. I arranged a dinner. My husband thought it was a celebration, our 2-year anniversary, and he'd been telling his children for weeks that he thought I was finally coming around to thinking about the future more openly, which I took to mean he thought the pressure was working. I invited his son and daughter. I invited my daughter, who knew everything and had been holding herself together with the discipline of a woman who wanted very badly to say something and understood why she couldn't yet. And I invited 4 other guests, my attorney, the investigator, a detective from the Fulton County Financial Crimes Unit, and the one person I'd located through 2 weeks of careful searching, his late wife's sister, who drove 3 hours from Chattanooga to sit at my dining room table. It was a warm evening in June. I'd had the back porch strung with lights. There were flowers from my garden in a vase on the table. I'd cooked, which I don't do often, because I wanted everything to feel like it came from me. My husband arrived first. He looked at the table settings, counted the chairs, and his face moved through something I recognized as calculation before he arranged it back into pleasantness. When the detective walked in behind my attorney, his son went still. When his late wife's sister came through the door, my husband made a sound I'd never heard from him before, something between a word and not a word, and sat down heavily in his chair. His daughter looked at me. I looked back at her steadily. I thought it was time for the whole family to meet, I said. I let my attorney do most of the talking because that's what I pay her for, and because I wanted to watch their faces, the forged documents, the email chains, the text messages, the pattern going back to his late wife, whose sister sat quietly across the table and did not take her eyes off my husband for a single moment. His son said it was all a misunderstanding. His daughter said nothing. My husband said he'd done everything out of love, that he'd been trying to protect me, that the documents were just planning documents that had been filed prematurely by mistake. His late wife's sister said quietly he told me the same thing. When I asked him why she'd signed her house over 8 months before she died, he said it was planning, it was protection, it was love. The detective made the arrests at my dining room table. My husband, his son, his daughter was not arrested that evening, but was asked to come in for questioning the following morning and ultimately cooperated, providing records and testimony in exchange for reduced exposure. I stood on my back porch after they left and looked at the lights strung in the dark, and my daughter came and stood next to me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. She finally put her arm around me and said, "You knew, didn't you? You knew before the wedding." I told her the truth. I didn't know exactly, but I was careful enough that it didn't matter. The divorce was finalized before the criminal case was resolved. The prenuptial agreement held without challenge. He received nothing. The fraudulent county filings were vacated by court order. My building remained mine. My practice remained mine. The criminal proceedings took almost a year. His son pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery and received 18 months. The charges against my husband were more serious: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and, after the cold case review that my investigator's report had helped trigger, 2 counts of criminal investigation into the circumstances of his previous partner's deaths. He was convicted on the fraud and conspiracy counts. The other investigations are still open. He is 68 years old, and he will not see the outside of a facility for a very long time. His late wife's sister called me after the verdict. She cried. She said she'd been trying for 4 years to get someone to listen. I told her I was sorry it took so long. I meant it. I'm 64 now. I still go to work every morning. I still make decisions about my practice, my building, my staff, my patients. My daughter comes up with the grandchildren twice a month, and my procedure rooms are covered in their drawings because I have no willpower where they are concerned. My practice manager of 11 years just celebrated her birthday, and I threw her a party that my patients keep asking about. I did not tell my husband that the property and practice was solely mine. I let him believe it was complicated and shared and hard to access, and that decision is the reason I am sitting here today with everything I built still intact. People will tell you that a marriage requires full transparency. People will tell you that keeping financial information from a spouse is a form of deception that undermines the foundation of the relationship, and maybe they're right in a marriage between 2 honest people. But here's what I know. When you have spent 30 years building something alone, with your own hands and your own credit and your own sleepless nights, you develop an instinct for when someone is circling what you built. I felt that instinct. I honored it, and I protected myself before I had proof, which meant that when the proof came, I still had something left to protect. I am not a cautionary tale. I am not a victim. I am a woman who built a practice and a building and a life in a city that did not always make it easy. And when someone came to take it, I was ready. Not because I'm extraordinary, because I listened to the voice that said, "Protect what you built. Don't let love make you foolish. Know exactly what you have, and never ever let anyone else be the only one keeping track of it." My name is still on that door. It's going to stay there. I've thought a lot about why things turned out the way they did for me, and why they didn't for the women who came before me. His late wife, who signed her house over 8 months before she died, and the woman before her, who added a man to her deed because she loved him and ended up with nothing left to give her son. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't that I was smarter or more capable than either of them. The difference was that I listened to something uncomfortable, honored it instead of explaining it away, and then I acted on it before I had proof, which is the only time acting on it actually matters. That's something I've come to understand about integrity in the real practical sense of the word. Not integrity as a feel-good concept, but as a discipline. It means being honest with yourself about what you're seeing, even when you'd rather not see it. I saw his daughter walk through my house like she was calculating square footage. I saw his son steer every conversation toward what my practice might sell for. I felt my husband's hand on my back at dinner, and I felt, underneath that warmth, something that didn't add up. Integrity meant I didn't gaslight myself. I didn't rewrite what I observed to make it more comfortable. I wrote it down internally and I kept watching. What I built over 30 years required a particular kind of stubbornness, the willingness to keep going when the reasonable thing would have been to stop. The bank loans I personally guaranteed, the 6 weeks I worked the reception window, the harvest of small daily decisions that, compounded over decades, became a practice and a building and a life that was genuinely mine. That stubbornness didn't leave me when I got older. It adapted. It became the thing that made me call my attorney before I confronted anyone. It made me hire an investigator before I showed my hand. It made me plan a dinner instead of having a fight. Resilience isn't loudness. Sometimes it's patience with a clear objective at the end of it. And then there's the part that people don't always want to talk about when they tell stories like this, the wisdom part, the part that requires you to be right rather than righteous. I could have confronted my husband the night I found the filing cabinet open. I would have felt better for about 48 hours, and then I would have had nothing but my anger and no case and no protection. Instead, I sat with what I knew and built something with it. I involved people who knew more than I did. My attorney, my investigator, the detective. I let his late wife's sister tell her own story at my table because her truth mattered and because it made the picture complete. Being wise enough to know what you don't know and to find the people who do, that's not weakness. That's how you actually win. My name is still on that door. Not because I was lucky, because I was honest with myself about what I was seeing, because I was disciplined enough to build a case instead of a confrontation, and because 30 years of doing hard things had made me someone who doesn't fold when folding would be easier. Those 3 things together. The honesty, the discipline, the willingness to keep going, that's what the women before me deserved and didn't have anyone helping them find in time. I tell this story so maybe someone else finds it sooner.